A young woman set off for an art show in another city and vanished without a trace. When police got involved, they uncovered a few disturbing clues, but none of them brought them any closer to the truth. The case remained unsolved for nearly 50 years, until detectives finally uncovered an unexpected truth that shocked everyone. Mary Kathleen Schleas was born on November 11, 1949, in Champlin, Minnesota. She grew up in a large family, and from a young age, she had a real passion for art. Mary loved drawing, and by the time she reached high school, she already knew that art was what she wanted to dedicate her life to. She went on to study fine arts at the University of Minnesota, focusing on both painting and sculpture. Her teachers immediately recognized her talent. They saw something truly special in Mary and believed she had a bright future ahead of her. Mary even earned several scholarships and eventually graduated with honors. Her work was featured in a bunch of exhibitions, which was a pretty big deal for her back then. She also studied abroad for a while, picked up fluent German and Danish, and even started learning Japanese. After graduating, Mary kept chasing her passion and traveled whenever she could. Since painting didn't really bring in much money, she lived simply and tried to save where she could. She shared an apartment with a friend, and when she needed to get from one city to another, or even to a different state, she usually hitchhiked. Back then, hitchhiking was actually a pretty common way to get around. Public transportation wasn't all that reliable, and if you didn't own a car, getting to another city could be a real challenge. Buses were few and far between, especially in smaller towns. Plus, in the 70s, hitchhiking didn't carry the same dark reputation it does now. Stories about people going missing or getting attacked didn't spread as quickly as they do today, so most folks didn't think twice about it. On February 15, 1974, Mary was 25 years old and planning a trip to an art show in Chicago. The journey from Minneapolis was around 400 miles, so she wasn't planning to do it all in one go. Her idea was to hitchhike to a city called Madison in Wisconsin first, then make her way to Chicago from there. Around 10:30 that morning, she left home carrying a sign that said Madison and headed toward the highway. About 3 hours later, a man named Dennis was driving along a rural road in neighboring Wisconsin. At some point, he turned onto a long dead-end road and noticed a parked car with two people standing next to it, a man and a woman. As he drove past, it looked like they might have been arguing or even fighting, but Dennis wasn't totally sure what he was seeing. He kept driving, but the scene kept nagging at him. A few minutes later, he reached the end of the road, turned around, and headed back. But by the time he got there, the car was gone. Still, something in the snow caught his eye, and that's when he realized there was someone lying by the side of the road. Dennis didn't get out of his car. Instead, he rushed home and told his wife what he'd seen. Then, he asked his neighbor to go with him, and the two of them headed back to the spot together. When they arrived, it was clear that what Dennis saw really was a person. It was a young woman, and there was blood on her clothes. They immediately drove to the nearest house and called the police. When officers arrived at the scene, they confirmed that the young woman was already dead. She had multiple stab wounds, but something didn't add up. There wasn't much blood in the snow, which suggested she'd been killed somewhere else and left there afterward. Not far from the body, police found a man's hat, which they believed might have belonged to the killer. Crime scene techs also tried to make casts of some tire tracks nearby, but the snow made it impossible for the casting material to set properly. There were no other clues to go on, so the body was sent off to the medical examiner for further investigation. In the meantime, police spoke with the only witness they had, Dennis, hoping he could give them something to work with. Based on Dennis's statement, he'd seen a white, slim-built man, probably between 25 and 35 years old, about 5 feet 8 inches tall with light brown hair. As for the car, it was a small, gold-colored sedan, but Dennis didn't catch the model or license plate. Meanwhile, the medical examiner determined that the victim had been stabbed around 15 times and died from blood loss. There were also several defensive wounds on her arms, which showed she had tried to fight off her attacker. However, there were no signs of sexual assault, which ruled out the most obvious motive. As they continued working on the case, the coroner was finally able to identify the victim. It was Mary. After speaking with Mary's roommate, police learned she had been planning to attend an art show in another city. The roommate also mentioned that Mary had taken her purse with her, but it was nowhere to be found at the crime scene. Knowing that she left the house around 10:30 a.m. and that her body was discovered roughly 3 hours later, detectives were able to piece together a rough timeline. The drive from her home to where her body was found would have taken about an hour and a half, meaning it was very likely that the person who picked her up in Minneapolis was the one who killed her. Police put together a composite sketch of the suspect based on Dennis's description and shared it with the local newspapers, hoping someone might recognize him. A few tips did come in, but none of them brought investigators any closer to finding the killer. At the same time, detectives started to wonder if Dennis himself might have been involved, and they had a few reasons to think so. They knew for a fact that he was on a remote dead-end road, and no one else had seen the other man he described. Some parts of his story also didn't exactly add up. Dennis claimed he'd gone to the store that day, and on the way back, he decided to keep driving for a while. When asked why, his explanation was unusual. He said his dog was with him in the car, and he thought she wanted to go for a longer ride. The reason raised more than a few eyebrows, especially since Dennis had taken a turn onto a dead-end road that hardly anyone ever used. Another thing that raised suspicion was Dennis's behavior. When he found the body, he didn't get out of his car. Instead, he drove all the way home to bring his neighbor back with him. While he was home, he didn't even bother calling the police. That only happened after his neighbor saw the body for himself. To investigators, it looked like Dennis might have been trying to stage an alibi, or at least distance himself from the crime. But there were also a few things that pointed away from him being involved. For one, there were tire tracks on that road that didn't match his car. Still, detectives couldn't rule out the possibility that another vehicle had simply passed through before the murder. Police also couldn't find any evidence that Dennis had been in Minneapolis that morning, which meant he likely couldn't have picked Mary up in the first place. But even that wasn't a sure thing. It was still possible that Mary got a ride from someone else first and then ended up in Dennis's car later. Police kept pressing Dennis for answers, but he stuck to his story. At one point, they even brought in a hypnotist to try and unlock any buried memories or hidden details. He tried twice, but both times it didn't work. Interestingly, one of the tips police received was an anonymous letter urging them to take a closer look at Dennis as a potential suspect. However, the letter didn't include any new information or evidence, just a vague warning. With no progress being made on that front, investigators started looking for any other possible leads. That's when they stumbled across an unsolved case from 2 years earlier, and it immediately caught their attention. Back in 1972, a young woman named Jolly from Minneapolis decided to hitchhike home, and 15 hours later, her body was found near a river on the outskirts of the city. Detectives started looking into a possible connection between her case and Mary's, since there were some clear similarities. Jolly's friends had seen her getting into a gold-colored car driven by a young man, and just like with Mary, the medical examiner found no signs of sexual assault. But despite how similar the two cases seemed, the investigation into Jolly's murder hadn't led anywhere either. There were no solid leads and nothing to go on. Investigators tried to find any thread linking the two cases that might point them to the suspect, but every lead ended up going nowhere. Over the next few months, detectives looked into a number of potential suspects, but none of them could be linked to Mary's murder. They also found a few witnesses who claimed they'd seen a man matching the composite sketch, driving a gold-colored sedan, but once again, it didn't lead anywhere. Eventually, the case went cold. Investigators just couldn't find a single new lead to move things forward. In the years that followed, the case was reopened several times, but each time, it hit the same dead end. In the early 1980s, police came up with a theory that Mary's killer might have been a serial murderer named Randall Woodfield. He had confessed to killing 44 people and was serving a life sentence. Most of his victims were picked up while hitchhiking, which made him a logical suspect in Mary's case. But despite the similarities, detectives were never able to find any concrete link between him and the murder. In the following years, investigators followed up on hundreds of leads that took them across nearly every US state, and even into Canada. But still, they couldn't figure out who had killed Mary. Over time, Mary's murder became something of a local legend, especially in the county where her body was found. People started reporting strange sightings of a young woman walking along the roadside, trying to hitch a ride. But as soon as they looked away, she'd vanished without a trace. 2 fishermen claimed they saw a similar-looking woman near a lake. They said she was glowing with a soft white light and just stood there in silence, watching them from a distance. Later on, a local woman came forward saying that a murdered woman named Mary regularly visited her and spoke to her. Since the case was never solved, those paranormal stories eventually became far more well-known than the actual crime. Many people didn't even realize that behind the ghost stories was a very real tragedy. In the early 2000s, as DNA analysis became a standard tool in criminal investigations, detectives decided to take another shot at finding a genetic trace of Mary's killer. Back in '74, the medical examiners had found traces of blood and skin under Mary's fingernails, likely from the attacker. The evidence was still sitting in storage, but unfortunately, experts weren't able to extract a usable DNA profile from it. But there was still one more lead. Remember the hat found near the crime scene? It had been kept in evidence all these years, and inside were a few short strands of male hair. Forensic experts tested them and managed to pull a partial DNA profile. But once again, they hit a wall. There were no matches in the FBI's database. Still, it wasn't all for nothing. That DNA was enough to rule out several suspects, including the serial killer they'd once suspected, since his DNA had long been on file. The case remained cold for several more years, until late 2022, when detectives learned about a new DNA technique called genetic genealogy. Realizing this might be their last real chance to solve Mary's murder, they reached out to a college lab in New Jersey that specialized in this kind of research, and the lab agreed to help. The experts got to work using the partial DNA profile taken from the hair inside the hat. The fact that it wasn't a full profile made things much harder, but after a long process of combing through public genealogy databases and building out possible family trees, they eventually landed on a potential suspect, a man who matched all the necessary criteria. All that was left was to get a DNA sample from him. Detectives tracked him down and asked if he'd be willing to provide one, and he agreed. But to their surprise, the DNA didn't match. Then, the analyst suggested another possibility. Maybe the killer was his first cousin. Detectives followed that lead and collected a second DNA sample, but once again, no match. The whole situation was baffling. Both of those men were clearly close biological relatives of the killer. That much was certain. But there wasn't anyone else in their family who could possibly be the suspect. That's when experts suggested a new theory. What if the killer had been adopted? That would explain why he didn't show up anywhere in the known family tree. The team began digging through old records to investigate that possibility. And on November 4th, 2024, they finally found what they'd been looking for. Based on everything they uncovered, there was a strong chance that the biological relative they'd been searching for was an 84-year-old man named John Miller. Detectives started looking into Miller's background and discovered that he had a daughter. They reached out to her, and she agreed to provide a DNA sample. When the results came back, it was exactly what detectives had been hoping for. The hair found in the hat at the crime scene belonged to her father. And just like that, 50 years after Mary's murder, investigators finally uncovered the identity of her killer. As soon as the lab confirmed the DNA match, detectives went straight to his home. Almost immediately after they told him about the DNA evidence, John Miller calmly confessed. He said that on the day of the murder, he picked up Mary on the side of the road and promised to give her a ride to her destination. But once they got out of the city, he started pressuring her for sex. When she refused, Miller pulled out a knife and stabbed her multiple times. Then, he drove down that remote dead-end road, planning to bury her body in the snow. While he was dragging her out of the car, a man drove by. Panicked, he jumped back in his vehicle and sped off, leaving the body lying by the roadside. The next day, he saw a newspaper article about the murder and felt relieved. The witness, it turned out, had gotten the color of his car wrong. According to Miller, he was driving a light blue car at the time, not a gold one. In the end, he said he didn't feel much of anything about what he'd done and had barely thought about it since. Miller also told detectives that he had tossed the murder weapon into a swamp near his home, though he couldn't remember what he did with Mary's purse. When asked if he had killed anyone else, Miller said no. He claimed he didn't even really understand why he had killed Mary in the first place. After his confession, he was officially charged with murder and taken into custody to await trial. But Miller made it clear he had no intention of fighting the charges. He said he would plead guilty because he didn't want to go through a long court process. As far as he was concerned, he was ready to spend the rest of his life in prison. So, in the end, detectives were finally able to solve this complicated case, even if it took 5 decades to get there. Despite the fact that Miller is now nearly 85 years old and unlikely to spend many more years behind bars, the case of Mary Schleas has finally been closed. As for Jolly's murder, Miller's involvement now seems unlikely. Given that he was driving a completely different colored car back then, it's very possible he had nothing to do with that crime. Still, investigators are looking into whether he might be connected to any other unsolved cases. But so far, they haven't found anything to tie him to any additional murders. Kathy Blair was born on May 31, 1961, in California. She grew up in a loving family with her parents, a brother, and a sister. From an early age, she had a deep passion for the arts, but music was what she loved the most. Singing was more than just a hobby. It was her true passion. So, when it was time to choose a career, Kathy didn't have to think twice. She knew exactly what she wanted. She enrolled at the University of Texas to study vocal performance and moved to Austin. After graduating, Kathy became a music teacher and a Christian choir instructor. She absolutely loved her job, and her students adored her. They could see how much heart she put into music, and her passion was contagious. Over the years, Kathy was married twice, but both marriages ended in divorce. She had 2 children, a son and a daughter, whom she raised on her own. In 2013, when she was 52, Kathy moved into a new home in a quiet, safe suburb of Austin. She had been dreaming of a place that checked all her boxes, and she had finally found the perfect one. By then, her children were grown and living on their own, while Kathy continued her work in music and led the choir. In December 2014, her son Joe came to stay with her for a few weeks. He was 23 and serving in the military. Before his next deployment, he wanted to spend some time at home with his mom. On December 5th, Joe went out to meet some friends and didn't return home until almost noon the next day. As he walked into the house, he called out for his mom, but there was only silence. Feeling uneasy, he started checking the rooms one by one until he reached Kathy's bedroom. What he saw there was horrifying. She was lying on the floor next to her bed, surrounded by a pool of blood. Joe knew immediately she was gone. Panicked, he ran outside and called the police. When investigators got there, they quickly confirmed that Kathy had been dead for several hours. And from the sheer amount of blood at the scene, it was clear this wasn't an accident. This was murder. While the medical experts examined the body, police officers began processing the crime scene. One of the first things they noticed was that the drawers from a large jewelry box in her bedroom had been pulled out and were scattered on the floor. It looked like the killer had taken some of Kathy's jewelry, leading detectives to consider robbery as the primary motive. But something about that theory felt off. For one, the intruder hadn't taken anything else. Valuable items like Kathy's laptop, phone, and other expensive things were left untouched, right out in the open. The house wasn't ransacked, and there was no sign that the killer had searched for anything beyond the jewelry. Then there was the timing. Break-ins at night were pretty uncommon. Most burglars preferred to strike during the day when homeowners were at work. On top of that, this particular neighborhood was considered one of the safest in the city. Crimes like this just didn't happen there. Another strange detail was the sequence of events. It seemed like the killer had murdered Kathy first and only then started searching for valuables. Bloodstains on the jewelry box drawers and other parts of the bedroom suggested that the attack happened before the so-called robbery began. That meant the intruder must have attacked Kathy the moment they stepped into her bedroom. Adding to the mystery, there were no signs of forced entry at the front door, although investigators found that the back door had been left unlocked. When they asked Joe about it, he explained that his mother often left that door open. With all this in mind, detectives started to wonder, was this really a robbery or just a cover-up? What if the killer had planned to murder Kathy all along? And if that was the case, it raised an even more chilling question. Could the person responsible have known her? And if so, did they also know about that unlocked back door? Despite their best efforts, forensic experts couldn't find any evidence that might lead them to the killer. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing that could identify the person responsible. The only clue they managed to recover was a partial shoe print in Kathy's bedroom, left behind in her blood. The medical examiners determined that Kathy had died from multiple stab wounds and also showed signs of strangulation. However, there was no evidence of SA, which only reinforced detectives' suspicion that this wasn't a random crime. It seemed personal. With no physical evidence to go on, police shifted their focus to Kathy's inner circle, looking for anyone who might have had a reason to harm her. Naturally, they started with her son, since he theoretically had the opportunity to commit the crime. But after checking his alibi, detectives quickly ruled him out. He had spent the entire night with friends, and his whereabouts were confirmed. Next, they spoke with Kathy's friends and coworkers, hoping to uncover any conflicts or grudges. But according to everyone they interviewed, Kathy had no enemies. She was well-liked, never got into fights, and devoted most of her time to the choir. Just when it seemed like they had hit a dead end, detectives came across a lead. Several of Kathy's close friends mentioned that she had frequently talked about her second ex-husband, the man she had divorced 4 years before the murder. According to Kathy, their breakup had been anything but smooth. Her ex-husband wouldn't leave her alone. He kept showing up, refusing to let go. At one point, she even told friends she was worried for her safety and asked them not to tell him where she had moved. Detectives tracked the man down and discovered he was living not far from Austin. When they went to speak with him, his reaction immediately raised red flags. The moment they mentioned Kathy's death, his first response was she shot? That struck them as odd. Why would he assume she had been shot, rather than stabbed or killed some other way? When asked about his whereabouts that night, he claimed he had been staying in his RV for a short getaway. He even let detectives search it without a warrant, but despite their suspicions, they found nothing. No weapons, no blood, no signs that he had anything to do with the crime. Without any concrete evidence, they couldn't pin anything on him. He remained on their radar, but with no real leads, detectives had no choice but to keep looking for other suspects. A few days later, detectives received an unexpected call from one of Kathy's friends, who had something strange to share. She and a few others had organized a memorial service in Kathy's honor, and during the ceremony, a man they didn't recognize stood up to give a speech. From the very first words out of his mouth, something felt off. His tone, his mannerisms, everything about him made the guests uneasy. But the strangest part was that no one there knew who he was. These were Kathy's closest friends, yet not a single one of them had ever seen this man before. And as he spoke, it became clear that he hadn't actually known Kathy either. His words didn't match reality, almost as if he was making things up on the spot. Curious, detectives asked around, and one of Kathy's friends finally recognized him. He had seen the man before. He worked as a sales clerk at a local women's clothing store. Police tracked this person down and questioned him. The man admitted he had never met Kathy. He said he had read about her murder in the news, felt sad, and decided to attend the memorial. His explanation was pretty weird, but there was no real evidence linking him to the crime. So, with nothing to hold him on, detectives had to move on, still searching for their killer. For several days, the case remained at a standstill until an unexpected twist changed everything. A man named Rob called the police, saying he had something they might want to see. According to his story, he had recently bought a new scope for his hunting rifle. This wasn't just any scope. It was equipped with a thermal imaging camera. Excited to test it out, he decided to take a walk in the early hours of December 6th, heading toward a wooded area near the edge of his neighborhood. As he walked, a car slowly drove past him before pulling over to the side of the road. A few seconds later, a man stepped out and headed down one of the nearby streets, disappearing into the night. At the time, Rob didn't think much of it, but later, when he saw the news about Kathy's murder, something clicked. The man he saw had been walking in the direction of her house. That's when he remembered his thermal camera had been recording the entire time. He went back and reviewed the footage, and there it was. The man, clearly visible, walking away from his car. Detectives were intrigued by the footage, but there was one major problem. It was recorded using thermal imaging, which meant it only captured the suspect's silhouette, so identifying him based on that alone would be nearly impossible. Still, the video provided some valuable clues. The man appeared to be tall, broad-shouldered, and had a distinct way of walking. And more importantly, the camera had also captured his car. Investigators hoped they could at least narrow down a list of possible vehicle models from the footage. They compared the man's height and build to their two main suspects, Kathy's ex-husband and the strange man from the memorial. But neither of them matched the silhouette in the recording. Their cars didn't match either. This only deepened detectives' doubts about both men's involvement, effectively bringing them back to square one. Over the next few days, they kept analyzing the footage, trying to extract any useful details, while also searching for new potential suspects. But despite their efforts, nothing substantial came from it. The case, once again, was at a frustrating standstill. Then, on December 15th, everything changed. That morning, police received a call from a caretaker who had gone to check on an elderly couple, Billy and Sydney Shelton. As she approached their house, she immediately noticed something was wrong. The front door was wide open, and there were clear signs of a forced entry near the lock. Stepping inside, she made her way to the bedroom, and what she saw was horrifying. The couple was lying in a pool of blood, their bodies motionless. Without hesitation, she called the police. Medical examiners later confirmed that both victims had suffered multiple stab wounds, just like Kathy. Meanwhile, detectives noticed a chilling detail. The drawers of their jewelry box had been pulled out and scattered around the room, with all the jewelry missing. But just like in Kathy's case, nothing else of value had been taken. Detectives couldn't ignore the striking similarities between this crime and Kathy's murder. From the very beginning, they considered the possibility that the same person was responsible. The victims lived just 15 minutes apart. Both attacks happened at night while the victims were sleeping, and in both cases, the killer emptied their jewelry boxes but took nothing else of value. From the beginning, investigators had believed Kathy's murder might have been personal, committed by someone she knew. But now, they had to reconsider everything. What if this wasn't about revenge or a personal grudge? What if the killer was choosing victims at random, based on some unknown pattern? Detectives looked for any connection between Kathy and the Sheltons, mutual friends, places they might have visited, anything that could link them. But there was nothing. Their lives had never crossed. That led to one chilling realization: they might be dealing with a serial killer. Now, this wasn't just about solving a murder, it was a race against time before he struck again. Police began re-interviewing everyone connected to the victims, hoping that someone would remember even the smallest detail that could lead them to the killer. They urged people to share anything, no matter how insignificant it might seem. And eventually, that approach paid off. One of Kathy's friends recalled a conversation they had a few months before her murder. Kathy had mentioned a disturbing encounter with a handyman who had been hired by her landlord to do some repairs on the house. She told her that the job had been done poorly, but more than that, something about the man's behavior had unsettled her. Detectives contacted the landlord, who was able to track down the worker's contact information. It was a local resident named Timothy Parlins. The first thing detectives discovered was that Timothy's brother worked at the church regularly attended by the Sheltons, and Timothy himself had also been seen there. Then, they dug into his background and found something even more concerning. Timothy had a long rap sheet. He had been arrested multiple times for theft, and his targets were almost always jewelry. At the time of the investigation, Timothy was out on parole and living in a long-stay hotel. Detectives went to see him, and he agreed to answer their questions. But when they asked to come up to his room, he refused. Instead, he insisted on speaking with them outside, in the hotel parking lot. At first, Timothy claimed he didn't remember Kathy, but when detectives provided more details, he suddenly recalled doing some repairs at her house. He insisted he had nothing to do with her murder, and even said he had an alibi. He had been working the night shift at a convenience store when Kathy was killed. As they spoke, detectives couldn't help but notice that Timothy didn't seem to match the silhouette from the thermal camera footage. He was significantly shorter than the man in the video, and his car didn't resemble the one seen that night. So, with no solid evidence against him, they left empty-handed. But then, something unexpected happened. When they called Timothy's employer to verify his alibi, they learned that he had been fired a week before Kathy's murder, so there was no way he could have been working that night. Detectives immediately rushed back to the hotel, but Timothy was already gone. Instead, his wife answered the door and allowed them to search their room. That's when they finally caught a break. Inside, they found a pawn shop receipt showing that Timothy had sold several pieces of jewelry, and the date on the receipt was the same day Kathy was murdered. Detectives went straight to the pawn shop and quickly confirmed that the jewelry Timothy had sold belonged to Kathy. But that wasn't all. The shop's security cameras had captured footage of the parking lot, and what they saw there was even more interesting. Timothy hadn't arrived in his own car, which meant he had access to another vehicle. After running the plates, police discovered that the vehicle belonged to his sister, and that was a crucial detail because the car looked almost identical to the one caught on the thermal camera on the night of Kathy's murder. That was enough for detectives to secure a warrant to search the vehicle. As soon as forensic experts started examining the car, they found traces of blood on the front seat and the floor. When the lab results came back, they confirmed the worst. It was Kathy's blood. Right after that, police arrested Timothy and brought him in for questioning. But even when confronted with all the evidence, he refused to admit anything. Instead, he kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "These hands have never killed anyone." Detectives interrogated Timothy for hours, pressing him on the evidence against him, and eventually he cracked, but not in the way they expected. He continued to insist that he hadn't killed anyone, but now claimed to know who did. According to him, the real murderer was a man named Sean. Naturally, investigators were skeptical. The case against Timothy was quite strong, and the sudden shift in blame felt like a desperate attempt to escape justice. Still, they decided to check out Sean, just in case. Nothing about what they found screamed murderer. Sean Gant Benelkassar, 30, was a former science teacher with a degree in microbiology, and he had no criminal record. On top of that, he lived several hundred miles from Austin, making his involvement seem even less likely. Still, detectives needed to be 100% sure, so they traveled to his town to question him. Sean admitted that he had met Timothy a few months prior and found him to be a shady character. They hadn't spoken much since, but a few minutes later he said something quite weird. He had actually been in Austin on the nights of both murders. Even more interesting, he revealed that he had stayed at Timothy's place during that time. The situation only grew more confusing from there. At first, Sean claimed that on the night of Kathy's murder, Timothy had left the house without saying a word. But just minutes later, he suddenly changed his story. Now, he admitted that they had actually gone to Kathy's house together. According to him, Timothy got out of the car and returned a few minutes later, carrying a blood-stained bag. Later, when Sean peeked inside, he saw some jewelry. That's when he realized Timothy had done something terrible. But he insisted he had no idea what was going to happen and had never planned to be part of any crime. As detectives continued questioning him, Sean asked to use the restroom, and they let him step out. One of the investigators watched as he walked away, and that's when something clicked. His stride, his posture, his movement. It all looked eerily similar to the silhouette captured on the thermal camera the night Kathy was murdered. That raised a serious question. Detectives were no longer sure he was telling the truth. Now, they strongly suspected that Sean was the real killer. But without a confession, they had nothing solid to build a case against him. With Timothy, at least they had some physical evidence tying him to the crime. But with Sean, they had absolutely nothing. When he returned from the restroom, they kept pressing him, challenging his version of events. They told him they didn't believe he had stayed in the car and suggested that maybe Timothy had forced him into Kathy's house, threatening him in some way. It was a calculated move, and it worked. Sean hesitated, then finally admitted that he had entered the house alone. According to him, he had gone inside only to steal valuables while Timothy waited outside. He said he slipped in through the unlocked back door and started looking through the rooms for anything worth taking. When he reached Kathy's bedroom, he saw the jewelry box, and Kathy still asleep in bed. Sean initially stuck to his story. He claimed he had carefully taken the valuables and left without harming Kathy. He even suggested that Timothy might have returned to the house after the robbery and committed the murder for reasons unknown to him, but detectives weren't buying it. They knew that blood had been found on the jewelry box, meaning the killer had only taken the valuables after the murder, which contradicted Sean's version completely. They kept pressing him, breaking down his lies piece by piece, and finally, he cracked. Sean admitted that he had killed Kathy. According to him, as soon as he entered her bedroom, she woke up and lunged at him. Panicking, he pulled out a knife and stabbed her multiple times. Once she was dead, he grabbed the jewelry, rushed out of the house, and got back into the car. Detectives still had doubts about Sean's story. They found it hard to believe that Kathy had suddenly jumped at him and tried to grab his knife. But regardless of the details, his confession was enough to arrest him. To strengthen their case, they took his shoes and had forensic experts compare the soles to the bloody footprint found in Kathy's bedroom. It was a perfect match. However, there was still one major problem: the murder of the elderly couple. When detectives questioned Sean about it, his entire demeanor changed. He immediately asked for a lawyer and refused to say another word. With no evidence directly linking him to that crime, investigators were at a dead end. So, they turned back to Timothy. He was arrested as an accomplice in Kathy's murder, and under Texas law, that meant he faced the same charges as Sean, even if he hadn't physically participated in the killing. Whether he liked it or not, he was going down with him. Timothy admitted that he had driven Sean to Kathy's house, but insisted that he had never stepped out of the car and had no idea his partner was going to kill her. However, he did confess to selling Kathy's stolen jewelry, which directly tied him to the crime. When detectives pressed him about the murder of the elderly couple, he admitted that he and Sean had gone there to rob the house as well. But just like before, he claimed that he had stayed in the car while Sean went inside. Investigators considered the possibility that Timothy was telling the truth. The thermal camera footage from Kathy's murder had clearly shown only one person exiting the vehicle. If the same pattern had been followed in the second crime, it was likely that Sean had acted alone once again. In the end, Timothy was charged in all 3 murders due to his role in the crimes, even though he hadn't committed the killings himself. As for Sean, he was officially charged with Kathy's murder, but detectives still weren't able to prove his involvement in the second case. At least, not yet. The court ruled that Timothy and Sean would be tried separately. During his trial, Timothy maintained that he had no involvement in the murders and had no idea his partner was going to kill anyone. But that didn't change the fact that he had driven Sean to both crime scenes and profited from selling Kathy's stolen jewelry. In the end, the jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sean's trial, however, was much more complicated. Unlike Timothy, who was directly linked to Kathy's case by physical evidence, the case against Sean rested mostly on his confession, a shoe print in Kathy's bedroom, and the thermal camera footage. His lawyer immediately went on the attack, claiming that detectives had coerced Sean into confessing and pressured him into taking the blame for someone else's crime. He also insisted that the rest of the evidence was purely circumstantial. As a result, the jury couldn't reach a unanimous verdict, forcing the judge to declare a mistrial. But prosecutors weren't giving up, and a few months later, Sean was back in court for a second trial. This time, the prosecution managed to convince the jury of Sean's guilt, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole for Kathy's murder. However, despite strong suspicions, he was never officially charged in the killing of the elderly couple. Investigators were certain he had committed those murders as well, but without solid evidence, they couldn't make the charges stick. In the end, both men faced justice, but there were still unanswered questions in the case. Detectives were never able to determine why Sean had killed his victims. If Kathy had really woken up while he was in the bedroom, he could have simply run away. It was pitch dark, and she wouldn't have been able to identify him. The only thing they could reasonably conclude was why Timothy had chosen Kathy as a target for the robbery. It seemed likely that he had held a grudge against her ever since she complained to her landlord about his poor quality repairs months earlier. That complaint had affected his paycheck, and he may have resented her for it. Whether that resentment played a role in what ultimately happened that night, no one could say for sure. But one thing was clear: what started as a simple burglary had ended in cold-blooded murder. As for the elderly couple, detectives had no solid theories about the motive behind their murders. They considered the possibility that Timothy had interacted with them at church and that some kind of conflict had led to his resentment, just like with Kathy. But that was purely speculation. When it came to Sean, investigators couldn't rule out the possibility that he had no motive at all, that he simply wanted to kill. If that were the case, then there was every reason to believe that he would have continued murdering if he hadn't been caught. One final crucial detail about Sean's second trial was how much weight the prosecution placed on the thermal camera footage. That single piece of evidence ended up being the deciding factor in securing his conviction. If that neighbor hadn't decided to test out his new thermal scope in the middle of the night, and if he hadn't happened to record the exact moments Sean left his car, the case against him might have fallen apart completely. Sean could have walked free. Misty Morse was born on April 10, 1978, in Springfield, Ohio. At some point, her family moved to a city called Indian Harbor Beach in Florida. Not long after the move, her parents decided to get a divorce, and Misty stayed with her mom but remained very close with her dad. She was a cheerful, outgoing girl who had lots of friends and loved outdoors. More than anything, she enjoyed swimming in the ocean, surfing, and just hanging out at the beach with her friends. After high school, Misty worked a few different jobs before enrolling in a local community college. She wasn't sure what career she wanted to pursue, so she planned to figure it out along the way. By the summer of 2000, 22-year-old Misty was working as a waitress at a local cafe and spending most of her free time with friends. On the evening of July 20th, Misty told her mom she was heading out. They talked for a few minutes, but then Misty's phone rang. She answered with just a few words, hung up, and told her mom she had to go. The next day, when her mother got home from work, Misty wasn't there. At first, she didn't think much of it. Misty sometimes worked late shifts, and on those days, they barely saw each other. Plus, she was an adult, so her mom thought that maybe she had just stayed over at a friend's place. But when another day passed and Misty still hadn't come home or reached out, her mom started to worry. It had been 2 days now, and there was not a single word from her. What made it even stranger was that they shared a car, switching off every week. But this time, Misty never came to pick it up. Her mom tried calling her multiple times, but Misty never answered. This went on until July 24th, when her worry turned into full-blown panic, and she decided it was time to go to the police. But before she could, there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, she saw police officers standing there, and the moment she looked at their faces, she knew something was terribly wrong. They told her they'd found Misty's body. On July 23rd, the day before police arrived at Misty's mother's door, a retired judge in Merritt Island stepped outside to mow his lawn. His property sat right along the river, and as soon as he looked toward the water, he noticed something weird. At first, he thought it was the body of a large animal in the river. Then, a strong, unmistakable smell of decay hit him. As he moved closer, he realized it wasn't an animal. It was a human body. The judge immediately notified the police. When officers arrived, they confirmed that it was a woman's body floating in the water. But they ran into a serious problem right away. The body was already in an advanced state of decomposition, making it extremely difficult to recover. To retrieve it without further damage, they had to use a special type of fabric, one that allowed water to drain through while keeping the remains securely contained. When detectives finally managed to retrieve the body, it became immediately clear they were dealing with a murder. The victim had no clothes on, and her wrists and ankles were bound with rope. Police also found large amounts of duct tape on her body. Her legs had been tied to plastic shopping bags, which investigators suspected had been filled with rocks or some other heavy objects meant to keep her submerged. But the bags apparently had torn open, and whatever was inside had spilled out. In addition to the rope and tape, detectives noticed something unusual. A few rubber cords, the kind specifically used to secure window protective screens, had also been tied around her body. All of these items were sent to the lab for analysis, while medical examiners began their work. But right away, they faced a major obstacle. Determining the exact cause of death was nearly impossible. There were no stab wounds or gunshot injuries, and the level of decomposition made it difficult to identify less obvious trauma. In the end, experts concluded that the most likely cause of death was either strangulation or drowning. The second theory suggested that she had been in the water for several days, and there was a strong possibility that she was still alive when she was thrown in. There were no obvious clues on the body, no DNA, fingerprints, or anything that could point to a suspect. So, investigators focused on identifying the victim. It wasn't easy, but the next day they finally got a match. Fingerprints confirmed that the woman found in the river was Misty Morse. By that time, forensic experts had already examined the ropes, plastic bags, and duct tape used to restrain her. But unfortunately, none of those items yielded any useful evidence. There was, however, one thing that stood out: a few short, dark hairs stuck to the duct tape. It was pretty obvious that they didn't belong to Misty, and detectives knew these hairs could be a crucial lead, so they sent them to the lab for further analysis. Once investigators confirmed Misty's identity, they went to speak with her mother. She told them the last time she saw her daughter was on the evening of July 20th. 3 days before Misty's body was found. She also mentioned something that caught their attention. Right before leaving the house, Misty got a short phone call. It seemed like someone had arrived to pick her up and was calling to let her know they were outside. But Misty never said who she was meeting, which made it much harder to track down a potential suspect. Hoping to find answers, detectives requested her phone records, but there was a major problem. At the time, phone companies didn't have the capability to provide details about incoming calls, not even the caller's number. The only thing police could confirm was that Misty received 2 calls that night. The first one lasted a few minutes. Then, shortly after, there was a second, much shorter call, the one her mother heard right before Misty walked out the door. When detectives searched Misty's room, they found her purse with all of her belongings, except for 2 things: her driver's license and her phone. The fact that she left her purse behind suggested that she likely hadn't planned to be gone for long, but somewhere along the way, something went terribly wrong. This led investigators to a troubling conclusion. Misty's killer was probably someone she knew well, someone she trusted enough to leave with that night. Forensic experts also had some interesting findings. While they hadn't recovered any clear evidence from the ropes or duct tape, they did notice something unusual. The type of rope used to bind Misty was commonly found on boats. Moreover, the nuts were tied in a way that suggested the killer had some kind of military or maritime training. These were not typically taught in the Navy and the Coast Guard. And then there was the duct tape. It wasn't just any kind of tape. It was actually a special type, designed specifically for temporary repairs on boats. All of this pointed in a specific direction. Misty's killer not only had access to a boat, but likely had some kind of military background. With no other solid leads, detectives turned their focus to Misty's personal life, hoping to uncover any connections that might bring them closer to finding her killer. Misty's mother told detectives that in the weeks leading up to her death, she had been seeing a guy named Teddy. He was a relative of one of her coworkers, and while they had gone on a few dates, their relationship hadn't had time to develop into anything serious. But when police looked into Teddy's background, they found something alarming. He had a long criminal record. He was arrested for assaults, sexual offenses, theft, and some other crimes. Detectives brought him in for questioning, and Teddy confirmed that he and Misty had been casually seeing each other for a few weeks, but insisted he had no reason to hurt her. As the interrogation went on, detectives started to second-guess whether he was involved. Teddy genuinely seemed upset about Misty's death, and nothing in his behavior indicated that he was trying to hide something. Still, they weren't taking any chances and asked for a DNA sample. At that point, they didn't actually have any DNA from the killer, so this was more of a test to see if Teddy was willing to cooperate, and he agreed to provide his DNA sample right away. He also gave them permission to search his apartment without a warrant. Detectives looked everywhere, but found nothing that tied him to the crime. On top of that, investigators learned that Teddy had never served in the military and didn't have access to a boat. In the end, they started doubting his involvement and turned their attention to other potential suspects. Misty's relatives told investigators about another guy she had gone on a date with, someone named Bobby. At first, he didn't seem like a likely suspect, but then detectives learned something that caught their attention. After their date, Misty told friends that Bobby wasn't really her type and that she wasn't interested in seeing him again. But Bobby didn't seem to get the message. He kept calling, trying to convince her to meet up again. He was persistent, too persistent actually. In fact, Misty even told people that she felt like he was stalking her. Detectives decided to pay Bobby a visit, and as soon as they arrived at his house, they noticed something that made their suspicions grow. He had a boat on his property. Bobby agreed to answer their questions. He claimed that he wasn't too bothered that Misty stopped responding to him, but he did admit that he had been calling her every day, right up until July 23rd. That's when he found out she was dead. For the most part, Bobby acted like he was genuinely upset about Misty's death. But then, something completely unexpected happened. In the middle of the conversation, he suddenly reached into his pocket and pulled out Misty's driver's license, then handed it over to the detectives. He explained that he had been holding on to it since their first date. According to him, Misty didn't have any pockets that night, so she asked him to keep her ID for her, and then she simply forgot to take it back. Detectives found this story highly suspicious. Their date had been weeks ago. Was it really possible that Misty never noticed her ID was missing? And if she had left it with him, why wouldn't she have asked for it back? With growing doubts, investigators asked for permission to search Bobby's home. He agreed, but after a thorough search, they came up empty-handed. There was nothing linking him to the murder. And then there was another issue. Bobby had never served in the military, which didn't match the profile of the killer. So, it seemed like Bobby was just another dead end. In the end, detectives left Bobby's house empty-handed, but just as they were about to leave, he surprised them yet again. He suddenly remembered something from his date with Misty, something that might actually be useful. According to Bobby, Misty had mentioned an ex-boyfriend who had a reputation for being quite aggressive. Bobby didn't know his name, but he did recall one key detail. The guy had served in the Marines. That immediately caught the detectives' attention, so they went straight to Misty's mother to ask if she knew who Bobby might have been talking about. She immediately had an answer. His name was Brent Huck. Her mother explained that Misty and Brent had been together for quite a while, but had broken up about a year before her death. She remembered that Misty had described Brent as controlling and aggressive. He always wanted to know where she was, who she was with, and what she was doing. Eventually, his behavior became too much, and Misty ended the relationship. After that, her mother never heard anything about him again. Detectives started digging into Brent Huck, and what they found was quite interesting. He lived in the same area where Misty's body had been found. He had also served in the Marines, just like their profile suggested. And on top of that, he worked as a charter boat captain, meaning he had easy access to boats and the type of specialized equipment found on Misty's body. With all of this in mind, detectives decided to bring Brent in for questioning, but they didn't want to tip him off. Instead of confronting him directly, they told him they were just trying to gather as much information as possible about Misty's personal life, since they had no strong leads. Brent agreed to talk. He admitted that he and Misty continued seeing each other from time to time after their breakup, but insisted that their relationship was completely over. There was nothing romantic between them anymore. But as the conversation went on, something felt off. Brent didn't seem even remotely upset about Misty's death. If anything, he was the opposite. He came across as cocky, almost arrogant. It was a stark contrast to how other suspects reacted when talking about Misty's murder, and that alone was enough to make detectives suspicious. Despite Brent's arrogant demeanor, detectives managed to get some very interesting information out of him. When asked about the last time he spoke to Misty, Brent named the exact night she disappeared, Wednesday, July 20th. That was the same night Misty told her mom she was heading out to meet someone. Brent admitted that he called her twice that evening, but he insisted that they never saw each other that night. That immediately raised red flags for detectives. Based on what Misty's mother had told them, they were convinced that whoever made the last call was the person who picked her up, and Misty's phone records showed that she hadn't received any other calls that evening. But Brent stuck to his story. He claimed that he had called Misty because he had heard some rumors that she was telling people she was pregnant with his child. At the time, he was dating someone else, and according to him, these rumors were threatening his relationship. So he called Misty to convince her to stop spreading lies. Detectives, however, weren't buying it. For one, medical examiners found no signs of pregnancy during Misty's autopsy. And on top of that, none of her friends had ever heard her say anything about being pregnant. So Brent's entire story just didn't add up. Detectives asked Brent for permission to search his home, and, just like the previous suspects, he agreed. But this time, they found more than they expected. The first thing that caught their attention was in the kitchen. Brent had multiple plastic bags from the same store as the ones that had been tied to Misty's legs. At first, this didn't seem like much. After all, plenty of people shop at the same grocery store. But detectives decided to take a closer look. Forensic experts examined the manufacturing codes stamped onto each bag during production, and when they compared them with the ones found with Misty's body, they discovered something disturbing. They were all made at the same time, on the same production line, in the same factory. This meant that there was a strong chance that the bags used in the crime had come directly from Brent's kitchen. And that was just the beginning. In his garage, detectives found the exact same type of rubber cord that had been wrapped around Misty's body. Just like with the bags, they checked the serial number and confirmed that both the cord in Brent's garage and the one found on Misty's body had been produced on the same machine from the same batch. Then, they found a roll of special marine duct tape, the same kind that had been used to bind Misty. And finally, they discovered rope identical to what was found on Misty's body. tied with the exact same military-style knots. At this point, detectives didn't just have a suspicion. They had evidence. After wrapping up the search and analyzing all those items, detectives were almost certain that Brent was responsible for Misty's murder. They believed that he might have actually heard rumors about Misty being pregnant with his child and panicked. Maybe he feared this would ruin his current relationship and decided to eliminate the problem before it could escalate. What he didn't realize, however, was that Misty wasn't pregnant, and she likely had no idea that these rumors even existed. With all the evidence in hand, detectives took their case to the district attorney, hoping to move forward with formal charges. But then, things took a frustrating turn. After reviewing the case, the prosecutor refused to press charges. He explained that every single piece of evidence was circumstantial. There was no direct proof, no DNA, no eyewitnesses, no confession, just a strong chain of coincidences. And as convincing as it seemed, the prosecutor warned them that it wouldn't be enough for a conviction in court. In the end, he told detectives they needed to find something stronger. So, despite having a prime suspect and a mountain of circumstantial evidence, investigators found themselves back at square one, knowing who likely did it, but unable to prove his guilt. Detectives did have one more piece of evidence, though, but unfortunately, it wasn't enough to crack the case. As we know, forensic experts had found a few short, dark hairs stuck to the duct tape on Misty's body. When they analyzed them, they discovered that the hairs belonged to an animal, most likely a dog. And Brent just so happened to own a black dog, a mix between a German Shepherd and a Rottweiler. Detectives strongly suspected that the hairs came from his dog, but there was a problem. In those years, no forensic lab in the country was capable of conducting a full DNA analysis on dog hair. Without that technology, they couldn't prove the hairs belonged to Brent's dog, and without the proof, the evidence was useless. So, with no other leads to follow, the case stalled. For months, detectives searched for anything that could break it open, but they kept hitting dead ends, and Misty's killer was still out there. For 2 years, the case remained at a standstill, until detectives took another look at the evidence and stumbled upon something new. They learned that a recent murder case in California had been solved using DNA analysis of dog hair, and this was exactly the kind of breakthrough they needed. Without wasting any time, they reached out to the same lab that had conducted the analysis in California and asked them to examine their evidence. Forensic experts extracted a DNA profile from the animal hairs found on the duct tape. Then, detectives collected a sample from Brent's dog. When the results came back, there was a perfect match. The hairs belonged to the same dog. And there was an even deeper connection. This wasn't just any dog. Misty had actually given Brent the dog as a gift back when they were dating. Now, detectives had the evidence they needed to finally bring him to justice. They went back to the prosecutor, and this time, he agreed to take the case to trial. On October 23, 2002, Brent was finally arrested, and a few months later, his trial began. Brent never backed down, insisting that he had nothing to do with Misty's murder. He claimed that the real killer must have been one of her other ex-boyfriends, but with the stack of evidence against him, the prosecution had no trouble convincing the jury of his guilt. In the end, Brent Huck was found guilty of kidnapping and murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. During the trial, prosecutors assumed that Brent had truly believed the pregnancy rumors and panicked, deciding to get rid of Misty before she could ruin his life. We may never know exactly how he convinced her to meet up that night, or how things escalated once she did, but detectives had their own theory. They believed Brent lured Misty to his home, tied her up, and loaded her into his boat. Then, he took her out on the water and threw her in, leaving her to drown. After his conviction, Brent tried to appeal, but the court denied his request. To this day, he remains behind bars, still insisting he's innocent. After the sentencing, Misty's father spoke to reporters. He said he hoped Brent would live 1,000 years in that prison cell, waking up every single day, remembering the pain he caused to their family. Kelsey Barrett was born on September 15, 1989, in Moses Lake, Washington. She grew up on a farm with her parents and older brother, helping with all kinds of chores from a young age. She loved working on the farm, but what fascinated her most were the crop dusting planes, those small aircraft that sprayed fields or scattered seeds. Kelsey had always dreamed of flying one, and as soon as she graduated high school, she enrolled in a local college to become a pilot. After earning her license, she got a job as a flight instructor while still helping her parents on the farm. Teaching people how to fly and working with her family kept her busy, but more than anything, Kelsey dreamed of having a family of her own. In 2016, when Kelsey was 27, she finally got the chance to start the family she'd always dreamed of. She met a man named Patrick online, and they hit it off right away. Like Kelsey, he was a farmer, and he shared her desire to have a big family. They talked for months before Kelsey decided to move to Colorado to be with him, and around the same time, they got engaged. Shortly after settling in, she landed a job as a flight instructor at a prestigious aviation school that specialized in training military pilots. It was a great opportunity, but there was one downside. The school was in another city, about 70 miles from Patrick's farm. Because of the long commute, Kelsey rented a place in town called Woodland Park. It was closer to work, but still within a reasonable distance from Patrick's home. Even though they had to live apart, they spent as much time together as possible, and their relationship moved quickly. In early 2017, Kelsey found out that she was pregnant, and soon after, the couple welcomed a baby girl. It seemed like Kelsey's dream of having a family was finally coming true. But not long after their daughter was born, things between her and Patrick started to fall apart. She noticed he was growing distant, pulling away from her, losing interest in their relationship, and showing less and less enthusiasm about their life together. Still, Kelsey wasn't ready to give up. She was determined to make things work and did everything she could to fix their relationship. On the morning of November 22, 2018, Thanksgiving Day, Kelsey planned to cook dinner for the holiday. She called her mom that morning, chatting about her plans and mentioning that she was heading to the grocery store to pick up ingredients for the meal. Over the next few days, Kelsey sent a few text messages to her mom, but then, out of nowhere, she stopped responding. At first, her mother assumed she was just busy. After all, Kelsey had a job and a 1-year-old daughter to take care of. But as the days passed and Kelsey continued to ignore calls and messages, her mom started to worry. Nearly a week had gone by without a single word from her. Growing increasingly concerned, she reached out to her older brother, hoping he had heard from Kelsey. But he said she hadn't responded to him either. Desperate for answers, Kelsey's mother decided to call Patrick, thinking he might know what was going on. But his response only made things more confusing. He claimed that he and Kelsey had broken up. According to Patrick, their breakup happened on Thanksgiving, more than a week earlier. He claimed that before the holiday, Kelsey told him she needed some time alone and wanted to end their relationship. Then, on Thanksgiving Day, she supposedly dropped off their daughter with him, took some of her things from his place, and he hadn't heard from her since. Kelsey's mother found his story hard to believe. For one, she couldn't imagine her daughter leaving her 1-year-old child behind without checking in, even once. And second, she had spoken to Kelsey on the very same day Patrick claimed all of this happened. Kelsey never mentioned a breakup. In fact, she had seemed completely fine. She was in good spirits and excited about cooking Thanksgiving dinner. Feeling uneasy, Kelsey's mom asked Patrick to go to her house and check on her. He agreed, but said he needed to finish up some work on the farm first. But the call never came. He never followed up. At that point, Kelsey's mother knew something wasn't right, so she made the decision to contact the police. She explained the situation, and the local department sent an officer to check her home. When they arrived, they found Kelsey's car parked outside, but there was no sign of her. No one answered the door, and since the police couldn't enter without a warrant, there wasn't much they could do. All they could tell Kelsey's mom was that her daughter wasn't there. However, officers did speak with Patrick, and he stuck to the same story. Kelsey had supposedly left him, saying she needed space. But this time, he added a new detail. She had taken some of her things from his house, including her handgun. He claimed she had been acting strangely in the days before she disappeared, and said he was worried she might have done something drastic. The police asked for access to Kelsey's home, and what they found inside only raised more questions. All of her belongings were still there. Her clothes, documents, and other essentials she would have taken if she had left on her own. But one thing was missing: her car keys. Her car was parked outside, yet the keys were nowhere to be found. That didn't make much sense. It was hard to imagine a scenario where Kelsey would take her keys but leave her vehicle behind. At this point, the local police department decided to officially open an investigation into her disappearance. One of the first steps was obtaining data from her phone. When investigators checked its GPS history, they found that the last signal from Kelsey's phone had been recorded on November 25th, 3 days after she was last seen. It came from a small town called Gooding. The problem was that Gooding was in Idaho, about 800 miles from Kelsey's home. That didn't add up. When police spoke with her family, they confirmed that Kelsey had no friends, relatives, or any known connections there. They had no idea why she would have gone to such a remote place. Detectives reached out to law enforcement in Gooding for assistance, but their search turned up nothing. In such a small town, a newcomer would have stood out, yet there were no traces of Kelsey. That was odd, and investigators knew they needed to look elsewhere for answers. They reviewed CCTV footage from the grocery store Kelsey had visited on Thanksgiving. The video showed her acting completely normal. There was nothing unusual about her behavior. She wasn't in a hurry, didn't seem distressed, and certainly didn't look like someone planning to disappear. She picked up groceries for dinner and even bought a flower before leaving the store. Police conducted another search of Kelsey's home, but once again, they found no clues. Days passed without any breakthroughs, and in that time, Kelsey's mother and brother flew to Colorado to help with the search. They stayed at her house, and right away, her mother had an unsettling feeling. Something just didn't seem right. But she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Then, one day, Kelsey's older brother went to use the bathroom and happened to notice something red on the inside of the toilet. It caught his attention, and when he looked closer, he realized it could be blood. He immediately reported it to the police, and tests confirmed his suspicion. It was human blood. But this discovery was just the beginning. Investigators had already searched the house once, but their examination had been fairly basic. This time, forensics decided to use luminol, a chemical that reveals traces of blood, even if it has been wiped away or cleaned to the point of being invisible to the human eye. They started spraying luminol in the bathroom, and what they saw was truly chilling. There was blood everywhere. It had been cleaned, but under the chemical reaction, it lit up across the walls and floor. The same thing happened in the living room. There were large stains of wiped away blood, revealing a gruesome scene that had been carefully scrubbed from sight. Samples were sent to the lab, and the results confirmed what investigators feared most. The blood belonged to Kelsey. But there was something else. Among the samples, forensic experts discovered 2 additional DNA profiles, one belonging to a man, the other to a woman. At this point, detectives were almost certain Kelsey was no longer alive. Their focus now shifted to identifying the 2 unknown individuals whose DNA had been found in her home. Naturally, Patrick became the prime suspect. Investigators had already found his version of events suspicious, but now that they were almost certain Kelsey was dead, their doubts about him only grew stronger. When they got access to Patrick's phone, they saw that he had been calling and texting Kelsey up until November 25th, the day she stopped responding to everyone else. Their messages mostly revolved around their breakup, but there was nothing particularly useful in the exchange. However, detectives were already leaning toward a different timeline. They believed Kelsey had actually been killed on Thanksgiving, November 22nd. The problem was that aside from those text messages, there was no real evidence that she had been alive for the next 3 days. That raised a terrifying possibility. Kelsey might have been murdered shortly after returning home from the grocery store, and if that was the case, someone else had been using her phone to send those messages. That's when detectives noticed something interesting. Patrick had repeatedly called a phone number with a Gooding area code, both before and after Kelsey disappeared. Wanting to know more, they traced the number and found that it belonged to a woman named Crystal. Investigators called her and asked how she knew Patrick. Crystal explained that they were essentially business partners. They co-owned several horses. When asked when she had last seen him, she initially claimed she couldn't remember, but after some hesitation, she admitted that they were supposed to meet right after Thanksgiving. According to her, she and Patrick had planned to buy another horse, so she drove to Colorado to see it herself. However, along the way, she found out that Patrick didn't have enough money for the purchase, so she turned around and went back home. Considering that the drive from her town to Patrick's was almost 1,000 miles, detectives found Crystal's story suspicious. It seemed unlikely that someone would embark on such a long road trip just to see a new horse. Adding to their doubts, Crystal claimed she hadn't even used her own car for the trip. Instead, she had borrowed a friend's vehicle because it was more fuel efficient. That detail felt oddly specific, almost as if she was trying to justify why her car wouldn't show up on any traffic cameras or toll records. Before ending the conversation, detectives asked Crystal if she knew Kelsey. She responded that she had heard about her on the news, but had never met her in person. That statement immediately raised red flags. Crystal lived in another state, and at that point, Kelsey's disappearance hadn't yet made national headlines. So how would she have already heard about it? After wrapping up their call with Crystal, investigators decided to dig deeper into her background. They discovered that she had recently gone through a divorce, so they reached out to her ex-husband, hoping he could provide more insight. When detectives asked Crystal's ex-husband if he knew Patrick, his response completely contradicted what Crystal had told them. He revealed that she and Patrick had known each other since 2006. Patrick was actually her first love. Over the years, they had an on and off relationship, but had always stayed in touch. Even more suspicious, her ex-husband claimed that their affair had never truly ended, not even after he and Crystal got married. According to him, she was still seeing Patrick in 2017, the same year he got engaged to Kelsey. But that wasn't all. Crystal had also lied to her ex-husband about her whereabouts after Thanksgiving. At first, she told him she had gone to visit friends from November 24th to 25th, but after the police contacted her, she finally admitted to him that she had actually been in Colorado. Then came another suspicious detail. On December 4th, Crystal asked her ex-husband to go with her to buy a new phone, claiming she had lost hers. Detectives immediately took note of the timing. December 4th was the exact same day they had obtained Patrick's phone for investigation. With all this information, investigators had enough evidence to obtain a warrant for Crystal's DNA sample. They flew to Idaho to collect it, and while Crystal complied with the request, she flat out refused to answer any of their questions. As they waited for the lab results, detectives reached out to the friend who had lent Crystal her car for the trip to Colorado. She allowed them to inspect the vehicle and mentioned that she kept a handgun inside. When investigators checked the gun, they noticed something alarming. One bullet was missing from the magazine. The friend was adamant that the gun had been fully loaded when she lent Crystal the car, and she had no idea where the missing bullet had gone. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. Investigators then spoke with another one of Crystal's friends, a woman named Michelle, and what she told them completely turned the case on its head. Michelle revealed that Crystal had called her in late October, about a month before Kelsey disappeared, and told her something shocking. Through tears, Crystal confided that Patrick had asked her to kill his fiancée. According to Michelle, Patrick told Crystal that Kelsey was mistreating their daughter. He insisted that he couldn't do it himself because it would be too obvious, and he needed someone else to carry out the murder. During the conversation, Michelle urged Crystal to go to the police, but she never did. This revelation completely changed the course of the investigation. Police were now almost certain that both Patrick and Crystal were somehow involved in Kelsey's murder. But despite the mounting evidence, they still had no DNA results and, more importantly, no concrete proof of what had actually happened to Kelsey. As investigators continued searching for more evidence, the case took another unexpected turn. Crystal called them and said that she had hired a lawyer and was ready to talk. When detectives met with her, she didn't hesitate and dropped a bombshell. Crystal admitted that Patrick had killed Kelsey and confessed to cleaning up the crime scene afterward. According to Crystal, Patrick had been planning Kelsey's murder for months, but from the very beginning, he had intended for Crystal to be the one to carry it out. Just as she had told her friend Michelle, Patrick repeatedly insisted that Kelsey was abusing their daughter, using drugs, and drinking excessively. He convinced Crystal that getting rid of her was the only option. Crystal agreed to help Patrick, and 2 months before Kelsey's disappearance, they came up with their first plan. The idea was simple. Crystal would poison Kelsey's favorite coffee with some medication. Since Crystal was a nurse, she had easy access to the necessary drugs. But there was one big problem. Crystal and Kelsey had never met. To get around this, she and Patrick came up with a cover story. Crystal would pretend to be a new neighbor who had just moved to the area and was introducing herself to the locals. In September, she put their plan into motion. She grabbed Kelsey's favorite coffee, went to her house, and knocked on the door. When Kelsey answered, they made small talk for a few minutes before Crystal handed her the drink and said goodbye. But Crystal actually couldn't go through with it. She hadn't poisoned the coffee. She just wanted to see Kelsey in person. And just like that, their first attempt failed. Patrick's next plan was more direct. Crystal was supposed to drive to his farm, pick up a metal pipe he had prepared, go to Kelsey's house, and kill her. She drove nearly 1,000 miles, picked up the pipe, and even pulled up outside Kelsey's house. But once again, she couldn't go through with it. She sat there for a while, then drove off without ever stepping out of the car. But Patrick didn't give up. His third plan was almost identical to the last one, but this time, instead of a pipe, he left a baseball bat for Crystal to use. Once again, she took the long drive, picked up the weapon, and approached Kelsey's house. And once again, she couldn't go through with it. At that point, Patrick realized if he wanted Kelsey dead, he would have to do it himself. According to Crystal, it all happened in the afternoon on Thanksgiving Day. Patrick showed up at Kelsey's house with a twisted plan. He told her he had bought several holiday-scented candles and suggested they play a game. She would be blindfolded and try to guess the different scents. Kelsey went along with it, completely unaware of what was about to happen. As soon as Patrick tied the blindfold over her eyes, he grabbed the baseball bat and carried out the murder. What made it even more horrifying was that their 1-year-old daughter was in the next room the entire time. After killing Kelsey, Patrick placed her body in a large plastic container and loaded it into the trunk of his car. Then, as if nothing had happened, he took his daughter and drove to his family's Thanksgiving dinner. While his relatives gathered around the table laughing and celebrating, Kelsey's body sat just a few yards away, hidden inside his vehicle. After dinner, Patrick drove out to a small town called Cripple Creek, where he had rented a barn, and left Kelsey's body there for several days. That same night, he called Crystal and told her she needed to come and clean up the mess he had made. She immediately understood. Kelsey was dead. Trying to cover her tracks, Crystal borrowed her friend's car, thinking it might help throw off investigators if the police ever looked into it. She then gathered a stash of cleaning supplies and set off for Colorado. While she was on the road, Patrick called her again. This time, he had a specific request. He warned her to be extra careful because he couldn't find one of Kelsey's teeth. He didn't want it turning up somewhere it shouldn't, especially not in front of Kelsey's family. When Crystal stepped into Kelsey's home, she was met with a horrifying scene. There was blood everywhere. It covered the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. She spent over 4 hours scrubbing the place, but some stains were impossible to remove, even with heavy-duty cleaning chemicals. So she gathered anything that had blood on it, rags, towels, and other items, stuffed them into garbage bags, and loaded them into her car. After finishing the cleanup, she casually stopped at a cafe for something to eat before heading to meet Patrick. They stopped at a gas station, where Patrick filled up a canister with gasoline. Then, they drove to the barn, retrieved Kelsey's body, and took it back to Patrick's farm. There, they built a fire and burned her remains. As they stood by the flames, Patrick's mother stepped outside. She watched them for a while, but whether she realized what was really happening remains unknown. Before Crystal left for home, Patrick handed her Kelsey's phone. For the next few days, she responded to texts from Kelsey's family and friends, trying to keep up the illusion that Kelsey was still alive. But eventually, she got rid of the phone, destroying the last trace of Kelsey's connection to the outside world. Despite helping Patrick cover up a brutal murder, Crystal insisted that she hadn't acted of her own free will. She claimed she had been terrified of becoming his next victim and only did what he asked out of fear for her life and for her children's lives. She said Patrick had threatened to harm them if she didn't cooperate. Before ending her confession, Crystal added that she had actually tried to help police catch Patrick. She claimed that she had deliberately left a few bloodstains in Kelsey's home, hoping investigators would find them. But detectives were highly skeptical of this claim. Crystal had countless opportunities to go to the police and prevent the murder. Instead, she not only allowed Patrick to go through with it, but had been willing to kill Kelsey herself 3 separate times. And even after Patrick carried out the murder, she didn't come forward. She helped him clean up the crime scenes, dispose of the body, and mislead Kelsey's family and friends. In the end, her confession wasn't motivated by guilt or a sense of justice. The truth was, her lawyer had advised her to take a plea deal, one that would drop all charges against her except for a single count of evidence tampering related to destroying Kelsey's phone. Despite Crystal's detailed confession, police still needed solid physical evidence to take the case to trial. They had already searched Patrick's farm once and found nothing incriminating. But this time, with Crystal's help, they returned to the property, and she pointed out the exact spot where they had burned Kelsey's remains. Patrick had done a thorough job of covering it up, so investigators had to dig through layers of dirt and ash. Eventually, forensic experts uncovered traces of a burned body. However, there was almost nothing left that could be used for DNA analysis. The only piece of evidence was the tooth Crystal had found while cleaning up the crime scene. But even that was so badly damaged by fire, investigators couldn't conclusively prove it belonged to Kelsey. Still, there was one crucial breakthrough. By this time, the lab results from the DNA samples found in Kelsey's home had come in. The results confirmed what detectives already suspected. The two unidentified profiles belonged to Patrick and Crystal. That was the final piece of evidence they needed. Patrick was eventually arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He spent the next years behind bars while prosecutors built their case against him, refusing to admit any guilt. According to the prosecution, Patrick had multiple motives for wanting Kelsey dead. First, their relationship was falling apart, and he wanted nothing more to do with her. But since they had a child together, simply walking away wasn't an option, so he decided to get rid of her permanently. The second motive was financial. Patrick was struggling with some serious money problems and was at risk of losing part of his farming business. Investigators believe this could have also played a role in his decision to kill Kelsey. Even though prosecutors couldn't pinpoint a single clear-cut motive, by the time of the trial, investigators had gathered undeniable proof of Patrick's guilt. One of the biggest pieces of evidence came from his phone records. Data from his smartphone showed that he had spent several hours at Kelsey's home on the day of her murder. This directly contradicted his claim that he had only stopped by for a few minutes to pick up their daughter and drop off some of her belongings. CCTV footage from a neighbor's house further discredited his story. The video showed Patrick arriving at Kelsey's home with their daughter. But instead of leaving shortly after, as he claimed, he didn't come back outside for several hours. Then came another damning detail. After leaving Kelsey's home, Patrick's phone traveled to his farm, but Kelsey's phone moved with him. He hadn't even bothered to turn it off. For the next few days, Kelsey's phone remained near Patrick's, tracking alongside his movements, until he finally handed it off to Crystal, who had used it to send misleading texts before destroying it. On top of all this, detectives uncovered a wealth of surveillance footage linking Patrick to the crime. One camera captured him driving with the large plastic container, the same one he later used to hide Kelsey's body. Another camera at the gas station recorded him and Crystal filling up a gas canister, further confirming their involvement in destroying the remains. Then, during the trial, another disturbing detail came to light. An employee at a mobile carrier store testified that Patrick had come in on the same day police confiscated his phone, asking a very suspicious question. He wanted to know how to remotely wipe all data from a device. But perhaps the most damning testimony came from someone inside the jail. One of Patrick's cellmates revealed that, while awaiting trial, Patrick had made a hit list. On it were 3 names: Crystal, her ex-husband, and Kelsey's mother. He wanted them dead. All of this left no doubt. Patrick wasn't just guilty, but he was still dangerous. Given the overwhelming evidence against him, along with Crystal's testimony, the jury unanimously found Patrick guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 156 years. As for Crystal, her plea deal got her an incredibly lenient sentence, just 3 years in prison. But a judge later reduced it to 18 months, with the possibility of early release after only a year. In the end, she served barely any time and has been free for a long time, despite the fact that she could have stopped the crime, but instead, she helped cover it up. On a more hopeful note, Kelsey's family was granted full custody of her daughter, and she has been living with them ever since. In honor of Kelsey's passion for flying, her parents also established a non-profit that provides support to aspiring pilots, ensuring that her legacy lives on. April Jones was born on April 4, 2007, in a small British town called Machynlleth. It was a quiet, peaceful place with a population of just over 2,000 people, located far from any big cities. April was the youngest in her family, with an older brother and sister. She loved spending time with friends, riding her favorite pink bike through the streets of her town, and swimming. In 2012, when she turned 5, April started primary school. She quickly stood out as a bright and determined student, and the teachers adored her. She was also a social butterfly, making friends with other kids almost instantly. On October 1, 2012, April went to her swimming lesson at a local sports center while her parents attended a school meeting. After that, she invited her friend over, and her parents drove them home. The girls watched a cartoon together, and around 7 p.m., April wanted to go outside for a walk. At first, her mom was hesitant because it was already getting dark, but April still found her way to convince her. She had done well in school the day before, so as a reward, her mom eventually decided to let her go. She just reminded the girls not to wander too far from home, and with that, April grabbed her bike and took off. About 20 minutes later, April's mom stepped outside to call her home, but she was nowhere to be seen. Panic set in immediately. She started searching the nearby streets, hoping to spot her daughter. The neighborhood was on the outskirts of town, a small residential area with several apartment buildings. She walked around, checking behind the buildings, but there was no sign of April. Finally, she spotted April's friend and rushed over to ask if she'd seen her, and the friend's answer sent chills down her spine. The girl told her that a car had pulled up next to them. April talked to the driver, got inside, and they just drove away. Hearing this, April's mom went into full panic mode and immediately called the police. Within minutes, officers arrived at their home and spoke with April's friend first. She described the vehicle as a gray van and said the driver was a man with dark hair and a beard, wearing a green jacket and sweatpants. She had gotten a good look at him because he actually stepped out of the van and helped April climb inside. Her mother later explained that April had cerebral palsy, which made it difficult for her to get into a vehicle on her own. April's friend also mentioned something that seemed a little off. She said April got into the van on the driver's side. Right away, police realized this likely meant the vehicle had a left-hand drive. That stood out because, in the UK, most cars have the steering wheel on the right side. April's friend had simply assumed she was getting into the driver's seat, but in reality, she was probably entering the van from the passenger side. Realizing that April had most likely been abducted, police immediately called for backup and declared it a critical incident. A massive search operation kicked off, and investigators sent out an alert with details on the suspect and his van. Word of April's disappearance spread like wildfire, first through the neighborhood and then beyond. Dozens of people gathered outside her home, eager to help with the search. But at that stage, the crowd actually made things more difficult for police, who needed to go door to door, questioning every resident. Meanwhile, people started sharing the news online, drawing even more volunteers to the area. As the night went on, hundreds of people joined the search, combing the streets alongside law enforcement. The situation was so urgent that even the local waste collection service stopped working, because every single worker left their job to help look for April. Before long, the case made national headlines. News outlets picked up the story, and the police issued a public appeal, asking anyone with information to come forward. They released April's photo and a description of the suspect, and soon, tips started flooding in. Unfortunately, despite the massive effort, the search turned up nothing. Within the first few hours, they had combed through the entire town, but there was no sign of April. The next step was to search the surrounding forests and fields, but that was easier said than done. By then, it was pitch black outside, and rain had started to fall. The terrain around the town was rough and hard to navigate, and officers knew they wouldn't be able to cover much ground overnight. Still, they refused to stop. The search continued until morning, and as the sun came up, even more volunteers joined in. Some had even traveled from other towns to help. Meanwhile, police expanded their efforts, putting up missing persons alerts on billboards outside the city, hoping for any kind of lead. With the news of the case spreading across the country, police were flooded with calls, but most of the tips didn't lead anywhere. Still, that morning, one name kept coming up, a name mentioned by multiple callers. It was a local resident, 46-year-old Mark Bridger. He quickly became a person of interest for several reasons. First, he matched the suspect's description. Second, he was one of the few people in town who drove a left-hand drive vehicle. But the biggest red flag was that someone had spotted Bridger's car near April's neighborhood, right around the time she vanished. When police started digging into Mark Bridger's background, they discovered a long rap sheet, though his crimes were mostly minor to moderate. He had been arrested multiple times for assaults, thefts, and various offenses like driving without a license. Detectives started tracking him down and found a few addresses where he could be staying. They sent officers to all of them at once, but Bridger and his car were nowhere to be found. Then, just minutes later, detectives caught a break. A police helicopter spotted him, walking his dog not far from home. But what really stood out was his behavior. The helicopter had been circling for nearly half an hour, and he never looked up, not even once. A short while later, a police officer approached Bridger and asked him to identify himself. He gave his name and immediately added, "I know what this is about." The officer then asked the question everyone wanted an answer to. "Where is April?" Bridger responded, "It was an accident. I hit her with my car." Right after that, he was placed under arrest and taken to the station. During the drive, he kept talking, despite the fact that the officer didn't ask any additional questions. He claimed he had no idea where April was because he had blacked out. According to him, after accidentally hitting her with his car, she was unresponsive. He panicked, put her in his vehicle, and tried to give her first aid, but nothing worked. Then, he said everything just went blank for hours, and by the time he came to, April's body was gone. Bridger insisted that after realizing what had happened, he spent the entire night searching for her, wandering through the forests and fields. He also claimed that he only found out who April was that morning, when he saw news reports about her disappearance on TV. Naturally, detectives weren't buying Bridger's story because there were too many inconsistencies. First, there was April's friend, who had seen everything. She clearly remembered April talking to the driver and getting into the van with his help, fully conscious. But Bridger insisted he had hit her with his car and placed her inside while she was unconscious, so his version just didn't match the eyewitness account. Then, there was the whole memory blackout claim. It sounded far-fetched on its own, but what made it even more suspicious was what police discovered next. Shortly after April disappeared, Bridger had shaved off his hair and beard. It looked like a clear attempt to alter his appearance and avoid being caught. Still, Bridger stuck to his story. When detectives pointed out the inconsistencies, he changed his tune slightly, now claiming he had been heavily drunk that day, which, in theory, could explain his supposed memory blackout. He also insisted that while he couldn't remember where he had put April's body, he was sure she was dead and in a safe place. No matter how hard investigators pressed him, they couldn't get the truth out of him. So they shifted their focus to his house. The moment they stepped inside, they were hit with the strong smell of cleaning products. The house was also uncomfortably hot. That's when they noticed the wood-burning stove in the living room. It had clearly been running for hours. Forensic teams collected the ashes and sent them for testing. But aside from that, there were no obvious clues. No sign of April, no belongings, nothing. However, when forensics took a closer look, they found traces of blood, and the lab results later confirmed it was April's. Next, investigators turned their attention to Bridger's car. If his story was true, that he had accidentally hit April with his vehicle, there should have been some evidence to back it up. But there wasn't. There was no blood inside the car, no damage to the exterior, nothing that suggested an accident had even happened. Once again, his version of events didn't add up. Then came the results from the ashes in his fireplace. Forensic experts found 17 fragments of human bone, all belonging to April. Another bone fragment was also discovered in the bathroom drain. This confirmed the heartbreaking reality. April was no longer alive. But detectives didn't believe Bridger had managed to completely destroy her remains. It was far more likely that he had taken what was left and hidden it somewhere. So, despite the grim discovery, police pushed forward with their search, determined to find whatever was left. The news that April was most likely dead sent shockwaves through the community. Until that moment, people had held on to hope that she would be found alive. Now, the focus of the search had shifted. Hundreds of volunteers and police officers were no longer looking for a missing girl, but for her remains, so her family could lay her to rest. By then, the search operation had grown into something massive. In fact, it would go down as the largest in the country's modern history. Alongside local volunteers, hundreds of professionals from various emergency services joined in. They searched through the most difficult terrains, rivers, forests, lakes, determined to find any trace of April. Meanwhile, detectives kept digging for evidence linking Bridger to the crime. When they examined his computer, they found something really disturbing. It was filled with illegal content involving minors. Even more sickening, he had saved photos of victims from other high-profile cases. On top of that, they found dozens of images of local children from their own town, including April and her older sister. It seemed like he had been downloading their pictures from social media. Then, investigators uncovered something even more unsettling. April's older sister revealed that just a few months before the abduction, Bridger had sent her a friend request on social media. She had mentioned it to their father, who immediately recognized the name. He had known Bridger back in the early 90s, but had lost touch with him over the years. The request struck him as odd. Why would Bridger, a grown man, want to connect with his teenage daughter? Trusting his instincts, he told her not to accept it. It's also worth mentioning that Bridger was a father himself. He had 6 children from 4 different women, yet at the time of April's disappearance, he lived alone. Police discovered a troubling pattern. Bridger frequently pursued relationships with women who had young children. Given the horrific evidence found on his computer, this detail took on a whole new level of significance and only made detectives more convinced they were dealing with a predator. As police dug deeper into Bridger's background, they discovered that he never stuck to one job for long, constantly jumping between different fields of work. He also had a habit of making up stories about himself. To some people, he claimed he had served in the military and even had to change his identity for security reasons. But that was a complete lie. What made it even stranger was that he repeated this claim during police interrogations. He insisted that he had served his country, that he was a good person, and that he would never have done something like this on purpose. Between that and his strange claims about April's death, detectives started to realize they were probably dealing with a pathological liar. It didn't matter how many times his stories were proven false, he just kept sticking to them. They also learned something else supporting this theory. Bridger had told everyone he knew that his parents were dead, but in reality, they were very much alive. Another interesting detail was that Bridger had broken up with his girlfriend just days before April's abduction. People who knew him said he didn't take it well at all. He started drinking heavily, and it only sent him further downhill. As police continued combing through his computer, they found something even more disturbing. Just hours before April disappeared, Bridger had messaged 3 different women, asking to meet up, but all of them turned him down. After that, he opened and watched some illegal content from his sickening collection. At this point, his guilt seemed undeniable, but there was still one major problem. April's remains were nowhere to be found. Desperate for answers, detectives repeatedly turned to the public, hoping that someone had seen Bridger or his vehicle that night. Any small lead could help them retrace his steps and finally figure out what he had done with April's body. At some point, a witness came forward with an interesting lead. He reported seeing Bridger the morning after April's abduction, around 9 a.m. The man was walking along the riverbank carrying a black bag. Investigators also discovered that shortly after that, Bridger had taken his car to a repair shop. The mechanics remembered him well because he had been acting strangely. By that time, everyone in town knew about April's disappearance, and emotions were running high. But Bridger talked about the case as if he were a grieving parent. He was on the verge of tears, speaking as though the missing child was his own. His reaction stood out to the workers. It was overly emotional, almost theatrical, and something about it just didn't sit right. Following this new lead, search teams focused their efforts along the river, hoping to find any trace of April. But no matter how thoroughly they combed the area, they still found nothing. Realizing that April's body might never be recovered, detectives made a difficult decision. They charged Bridger with murder, relying on the overwhelming evidence they already had. With April's blood found inside Bridger's home, police pieced together what they believed had happened. Their theory was that Bridger lured April into his car under some pretense, then took her back to his house, committed SA, and killed her. After that, he started disposing of her body. Investigators learned that Bridger had previously worked at a slaughterhouse. They suspected he might have used those skills to get rid of the body before burning parts of her remains in his fireplace. But forensic experts agreed there was no way he had gotten rid of everything, which meant some of it had to be hidden somewhere else. With the case moving forward, Bridger was placed in jail to await trial, which was set to begin in a few months. Meanwhile, search teams weren't planning to give up. Even as the weather got worse and new leads dried up, they kept searching, still hoping to find April's remains. The prosecution was confident they could secure a conviction even without a body, but they still refused to give up the search. In total, search teams scoured 60 square kilometers or 37 square miles of land, covering every possible location where April's remains could have been hidden, but they found nothing. In the end, April's parents had no choice but to bury only the small fragments recovered from Bridger's home. To honor her memory, they also placed some of her belongings inside the coffin. Hundreds of people attended her funeral, many traveling from other towns, just to say goodbye. Over the course of the search, April had become like family to an entire community, and now they had to let her go. In January 2013, 3 months after April's murder, Bridger stood before the judge and pleaded not guilty to murder, but at the same time, he admitted that he was likely responsible for her death. During the trial, he stuck to his story, claiming that he had accidentally run over April with his car, despite overwhelming evidence proving otherwise. He also insisted that he still couldn't remember where he had hidden her remains. And yet, Bridger continued to paint himself as the good guy, saying he had only wanted to help April after the so-called accident. The trial lasted until late May, and in the end, the jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, which is a pretty rare sentence in the UK. After the trial, Bridger was transferred to a new prison, where he was attacked by another inmate. He stabbed him several times with a shank, but the injuries weren't fatal. For years after his conviction, detectives kept reaching out to Bridger, hoping he'd finally tell them where April's remains were. But he never wavered. He just kept insisting he remembered nothing. Then, out of nowhere, police got a tip from another inmate. According to him, Bridger had confessed, saying he had dumped April's remains in the river near his home. But investigators weren't convinced. If a bag containing human remains had been thrown into the water, it likely would have surfaced. And given that search teams had thoroughly scanned the river for miles, it seemed highly unlikely that Bridger was telling the truth. A year after his sentencing, the local government bought Bridger's house, and in November 2014, they decided to demolish it. Hundreds of locals, including April's parents, gathered to watch as the house was torn down, the very place where she had been taken from them. In 2018, April's family faced yet another heartbreaking ordeal. Her father fell seriously ill and suffered partial memory loss. When he regained consciousness, he started asking his wife why April hadn't come to visit him in the hospital. And so, she had to break the news to him all over again, telling him that their daughter was gone. In a cruel twist of fate, he was forced to relive the pain of losing April a second time. As for the search for her remains, it hasn't resumed since 2013. Police have stated that they are willing to restart the search if new information comes in, but so far, there has been no progress. It has now been over 12 years since April was taken, and detectives admit that the chances of ever finding her are slim to none. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.